Greetings, this is Script Ruby with part 5 of my series, Foundation's Progress, which is the story of Dr. Asimov's writing of his famous Foundation series. As we left off, it was taking a short break from writing stories of the Foundation, but it was time to start again. In January of 1945, however, it was time to begin his next Foundation story. He describes the creative sessions over it with Mr. Campbell thus, on page 450 of In Memory at Green. On the January 8th visit, we discussed the next Foundation story, and Campbell said he wanted to upset the Seldon Plan, which was the connecting backbone of the series. I was horrified. No, I said. No, no, no. But Campbell said yes, 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 and I knew I wasn't going to sell him a no, no. I made up my mind, rather sulkily, I was still brooding over escape, to follow orders, but to get my own back by making the new Foundation story the longest and biggest and widest yet. On January 26, 1945, then, I began The Mule. On that day, I had been married 2.5 years, and that may have influenced me, for the heroine, Beta, was modeled on Gertrude, certainly in appearance. Toran, her husband, was modeled on myself, though his appearance wasn't described as similar to mine. Beta was, of course, the key to the whole story and was the person who defeated the Mule at the end, while Toran was definitely subsidiary and bubbled about in Beta's wake. I suppose that was the way I viewed the family situation. I was clever academically, and I had a writing talent. For the rest, I never felt that I was particularly bright in anything that had to do with ordinary living and with human interrelationships. As for the Mule himself, his personal appearance was based on my friend Leonard Meisel, who by then was the only person at the Navy Yard with whom I could completely relax. I worked rapidly, more rapidly than I had at any other time during the war. To be sure, the story took me some 3.5 months to complete, but it ended being 50,000 words long, approaching novel length. It was the very first story I had ever written that was so long and had so intricate a plot, and that had so lengthy a cast of characters, and with Gertrude to inspire me, I think that Beta was the first successful, well-rounded female character I ever had in any of my stories. So, Memory at Green, page 420, he compares and contrasts the fall of the Mule as he's writing it with the fall of Adolf Hitler, which was happening at the same time. Quote, I kept racing ahead in the last stages of the Mule. It was almost as though the Mule's ambitions were collapsing in time to Hitler's. He footnotes the Mule was in no way a Hitlerian character, however. The storyline worked out as it did precisely because the Mule was not a complete villain. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe was over. It was VE, Victory in Europe, Day. For me, on a much smaller scale, the month had its victory too. I finished the Mule on May 15, brought it to Campbell on May 21, and received the acceptance on May 29 in the form of a check for $875, 50,000 words at 0.0175 cents per word. That was an incredible sum. That one check was only a little less than I had made in the first 3 years after my first visit to Campbell. It represented a quarter of my annual salary at the Navy Yard. Yet my comment in the diary was, falls flat somehow, however. I guess I'm so sure of sales these days, the thrill is gone. Certain succession evicts one from the paradise of winning against the odds. Yeah, it does. Whatever historical comparisons might well be made between the coming of the Mule and the conquest of Europe by the Mongols, or even the rise and fall of Hitler, the true source of this is seen here as having been a decision by Mr. Campbell imposed on Asimov, who had come up to this point never intended such a change in direction. Never had psychohistory been so wonderfully and dramatically portrayed as in Dead Hand, in which even abject failures on the part of all Foundation personnel proved irrelevant to the inability of the fading, but still huge empire to conquer the still relatively small but upcoming Foundation. Realistically, what could psychohistory have done which was anywhere near as dramatic as that? The suggestion to upset the Seldon Plan, thus taking things in a whole different direction, and also requiring significant retconning of the Second Foundation, heretofore to be physically located at the opposite end of the galaxy at a place simply called Star's End, a fitting counterpoint to a place called Terminus, actually had its basis in the editorial direction of astounding science fiction. The change also fails to be consistent with the original introduction of the first installment, in which Harry Seldon conducts and closes the final meeting of his 50 secretive group members as if all was done, other than to instigate riots on Anacreon and Loris 50 years hence. No need for a continuing second foundation. The character Beta also has some basis in his then still new wife Gertrude and Toran himself and the Mule, a friend of his. One can only speculate in wondering what directions things would have taken had this radical shift in direction not been imposed. What would have happened once the two foundations met? What if one had fallen in purpose, depending upon the other to carry it all on forward to the Second Empire? What if each had, perhaps even legitimately, thought the other had fallen? What if, with neither being oppressively fallen, the leadership of each wanted to be supreme and were willing to go to war with each other over that? Or had he figured that perhaps with two, if one should fall, the other could step in and help the other? And as the reader finally approaches the establishment of the Second Galactic Empire, what remaining challenges could make it worth reading? The retconning also introduced its own new difficulties. If the Second Foundation was ultimately meant to be such a secret, then what good was there in Seldon mentioning it at the close of each of his recordings? And once the Second Foundation was forced to act, making its different nature a matter of common knowledge, and thus forcing it to fake its own demise, what were those remarks of Seldon about a Second Foundation at the other end of the universe supposed to be worth? And supposing that the Mule had not come along, and that no other series of events would arise that would force the Second Foundation to reveal itself, what were those of the First Foundation supposed to make of it when, having taken over clearly more than half of the whole galaxy, they had utterly failed to meet up with a Second Foundation rising up from the opposite end of the galaxy? Or might one expect some explorations to seek it to be made at some point, now known to be necessarily unsuccessful? Of course, with the Second Foundation revealed, and having faked its demise, that problem goes away. But would not the lack of that problem create serious ripples in the psychohistory of the plan? What mention of the Second Foundation would Seldon have been making from his simulacrum in all those later seasons of the plan, with or without them revealed, sought, or not found? He describes the completion of this segment, which he characterizes as his personal favorite, now titled The Mule, thus, on page 443 of the early Asimov. Quote, "The Mule set several records for me. It was the longest story I had ever written up to that time, 50,000 words long. Yet even so, and despite the fact that I had to work on it in small scraps of time left over from job and marriage, I managed to complete it in 3.5 months. It was submitted on May 21, 1945, and was accepted on the 29th. Indeed, throughout the war, I never got a single rejection or even a delayed acceptance, nor did I submit to anyone but Campbell. What's more, at the beginning of 1944, Campbell raised his basic rate to 1.5 cents a word, and some months later to 1 cent and 3/4. For the Mule, I received a check at the higher rate for $875. It was, by far, the largest check I ever received for a single story. By the end of the war, in fact, I was making half as much money writing in my spare time as I was making at my NAES job, even though I had been promoted and was receiving $60 a week by the end of the war. Then, too, The Mule was the first story I ever had published as a serial. It appeared in 2 parts in the November and December 1945 issues of Astounding. It also managed to end his first part with the greatest cliffhanger since that of the opening installment. Not only was the 48,302-word story, The Mule, the longest Foundation story he had written by then, but also, despite its origins and an editorial direction he had opposed, it emerged as his favorite of all the Foundation installments. But now, with the whole nature of the Second Foundation being redefined as one operating quite differently from the First Foundation, the whole course of the work had to be different now. It wouldn't have done to have the Second Foundation simply be a copy of the First and now presumably stepping in to help the First. The creation of a new galactic empire by the Mule would have quickly destroyed a Second Foundation that operated too much like the First. Though the Mule is finally met up with, and his galactic ambitions crippled by the twin realizations that the second foundation was quite different from the first, and also that it had concealed itself with such thoroughness that its efforts to take over the whole galaxy would have to wait until he could track it down and destroy it. The whole Foundation universe ends that segment in a considerable disarray. Meanwhile, the 24,371-word story, Dead Hand, was seeing print. First announced in the March 1945 issue, the story hit the newsstand on March 20 with the April issue. The introduction in the March issue read, "Coming up next month is Dead Hand, Isaac Asimov's latest Foundation story. The Foundation series has followed the rise of the Encyclopedia Foundation from its wild goose chase of a publication of all knowledge to the days of the traders working in the revolting kingdoms at the fringe of the dying galactic empire. Once the Foundation was threatened with conquest by local kingdoms, and smart leaders saved them by playing one kingdom against the other. Again, it was threatened by local kingdoms, and smart leaders, using the cult they had set up, saved it. Then it was threatened by the dying empire, when no one of the governors of that volume of the empire tried to bring it under his control. Again, Foundation won, by simply waiting. But what if a strong, clever general, commanding the forces of the still vast, still mighty empire, during a period of resurgence under a strong, clever emperor, attacks the Foundation during a time when the Foundation leaders all happen to be weak, stupid, and bewildered? Under such conditions, the Foundations will be the winner. Think not? It's a rather astonishing sort of setup, but follow it through. It adds up. And Asimov's right. The stupidly led, small, weak Foundation cannot be conquered even when the mighty Empire's forces, under a strong, clever general with a strong, clever emperor at home, attacks. Cockeyed, people has always been. Gosh. The page blurb for Dead Hand read, "The Foundation had always been weak, but heretofore the sharp wits of its leaders had protected. But this time, Foundation's leaders were stupid men, and a clever general under a strong emperor was attacking." Analytics for Dead Hand shows that it took first place with a score of 1.61. But now, with this newly drafted story, the Mule in the works, the saga had grown long and complicated, and now, all the worse, with a considerable where do we go from here problem. For the first time, a story of his would be so long that it had to be broken up into two parts. It appeared unannounced in the November and December issues, released October 18 and November 15 respectively, with the page blurbs that read, "First of two parts of Asimov's first serial of the Foundation, and of the one factor that even Hari Seldon could not predict, could not defend the Foundation against. The defenses were based on human psychology. The Mule was a mutant." And second two parts, across the ruined, dying galactic empire, fleeing from a conquered Foundation, three frightened people and the hunted jester of the new conqueror, the Mule, sought the second Foundation, the only hope, but it must be warned. Analytics for the Mule Part 1 shows that it took first place with a score of 1.2, and that for the Mule Part 2 that it took second place with a score of 1.8. So, page 482 of Memory of Green states, "On September 9, 1946, I went to see Campbell and brought up little lost robots.